kickoff activity for the upcoming Sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. From April of 2011 to April of 2015, cities and towns across the country will be commemorating events and activities associated with America's great Civil War. Now, there are some young people in our audience, and I want to point out to you that I just finished using the word commemorate, which means remembrance, or to mark by ceremony. I did not say celebration. We do not celebrate war, and we do not celebrate the loss of 620,000 American lives, both north and south. I'd like to put that in perspective for you. If today we had an event that involved 2% of the population, as they did 150 years ago, and it was some great war or great tragedy, that number today would be over 6 million American lives lost. That's how significant the American Civil War was to the country at that time. We're not here tonight, however, to talk about the war in very much detail at all. We're here to welcome a man from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln. He's just been elected President of the United States in a very difficult election. And from the time that he was notified that he is now the President-elect, he has had not a word to say to the American public about what's going on in the country. 7 states have seceded from the Union, and still no comment from Mr. Lincoln. His supporters refer to this as masterful inactivity. And it's chosen as a strategy because Mr. Lincoln knows that no matter what it is that he says, half the country is going to be upset with him. On the morning of February 11th, 1861, in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, he gets on a train to begin the inaugural journey to Washington City. The key element of what he does on that train is to recognize that people want to hear what he has to say, and people want to see him. Thousands line the railroad tracks along his route just to get a glimpse of him, and thousands more join him at every stop the train makes to hear what he has to say. Now, our program this evening has been made possible by the National Park Service, and we have 3 of their members with us this evening that I'd like to introduce to you. Each of those 3 is going to be accompanying Mr. Lincoln on the entire 13-day journey that lies ahead, 12 days now, and the 13 city stops that are planned over this period of time. In the very back, Tim, if you would raise your hand, Timothy Good. Timothy Good is the superintendent of the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, and he is the coordinator for this project. Dave Schaefer in back. Dave is the Chief of Interpretation of Brown v. Board National Historic Site. He is the assistant coordinator for this event. And Spirit Tricky, who promised me she'd be up front here. Spirit's right over here. She is a park ranger at the Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site. And I might add, she is also the daughter of one of the Little Rock 9. We'll be hearing from Ranger Tricky in just a few moments. The presentation this evening is also going to be supplemented by members of the Cincinnati History Museum, staff and friends, and they're going to bring a certain local flavor to the evening's activities so that you can better understand how big and how important Mr. Lincoln's visit was to our fair city. We're also pleased to have with us this evening members of the Kolping Saengerchor behind me here. As you well know, the Germans represented a pretty fair percentage of our population, and when Mr. Lincoln came to town, German music could be heard all over town. Now, before we begin, I have an instruction for you. Wherever Mr. Lincoln went, whenever he appeared, the crowds were enthusiastic. They clapped loud and long, and huzzahs, not hooray, not hurrah, but huzzahs, could be heard all over town. So, if you're so inclined and want to join in the fun, we encourage you to do so. And not only help us welcome Mr. Lincoln, but help us celebrate his birthday this evening as well. Spirit Tricky of the National Park Service, who will help us place Mr. Lincoln's remarks in the historical context of the time. Reakirt.
Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? Wonderful. Thank you for the warm introduction. Spear Tricky. I'm a park ranger at Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I'm honored to participate in the National Park Service's commemoration of the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's inaugural journey. So on behalf of the National Park Service, I would like to thank Bob Limoseth very much, and also the Cincinnati History Museum, and you for coming out tonight to make this program so wonderful. We're delighted to be with you tonight as we pause to consider a critical moment in the nation's history. It's vitally important to remember our nation's history so that we can better understand who we were, who we are, and who we hope to be. 150 years ago, Americans grappled with a crisis that threatened to split the nation in two. Southern states, inspired by South Carolina's lead, were voting to leave the Union. 7 southern states would soon form the Confederate States of America and elect Jefferson Davis as president. What led Southerners to take such drastic action? Well, the short answer is the election of President Abraham Lincoln as president. Lincoln, the first Republican president, was elected in November of 1860 on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. But many Southerners feared that Lincoln's election also threatened slavery where it already existed. In February of 1861, 150 years ago this month, President-elect Abraham Lincoln was traveling by train to Washington, D.C. A prairie lawyer from Illinois, Lincoln was going to be sworn in as the nation's 16th president. As Lincoln gazed out the window as the train rattled along, you can imagine what type of thoughts were going through his mind. What would be asked of him in the coming 4 years? Would he measure up to the task? How would he respond to the challenges of the Lower South's decision to leave the Union? Day by day, Lincoln's train rolled through small towns dotted with church spires and larger cities teeming with regular citizens going on with their everyday lives. What would be asked of them in the years ahead? In addition to the question whether the United States would splinter into 2 separate countries, another fundamental question was at stake. In 1861, 4 million American men, women, and children were enslaved. They were considered property. They could be bought and sold. What would be their fate in this crisis? With a nod to the founding generation, Lincoln would write in 1863 that this nation had been conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. Would the crisis, the national emergency in 1861, lead to the fulfillment of the nation's founding ideals of freedom and equality? Would there be a new birth of freedom, as radical abolitionists desired, or would slavery survive the crisis? And please remember, as the nation teetered on the brink of civil war 150 years ago, Americans did not know how it would turn out, just as we don't know today what tomorrow will bring. Our ancestors 150 years ago did know one thing, however, and that is that the crisis would bring about a change. But no one knew for sure what that change would be, what the story would be. My story began over 50 years ago as the first 9 African American students braved a hostile mob and death threats as they walked up the front steps of the previously all-white Central High School in Little Rock in 1957. As mentioned, my mother, Minnie Jane Brown Tricky, was one of those students. So just as my mother, over 50 years ago, introduced a pivotal moment in our civil rights movement, I have the honor and privilege today to introduce you to, first, before we hear from President-elect, Henri Lovie, who will then introduce President-elect Abraham Lincoln. When you have the opportunity to hear from Lincoln, listen to what he has to say, because what he says tonight is taken from his actual words, and words that convey the conflict, the uncertainty, and hope of his story, and of our story as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Henri Lovie.
spent a week here in 1855 for the McCormick Reaper trial. Again, he spent time here in September of '59 stumping for Republican candidates. Lincoln did not come to Cincinnati in 1861 by accident. Several committees went to Springfield, Illinois to convince the president-elect he must stop in Cincinnati on his way to Washington City. Cincinnati, on the eve of the Civil War, was known by many names. Porkopolis, the Queen City, was a center of commerce and industry. Cincinnati was the largest city west of the Alleghenies, the 7th largest city in the nation. We were home to a large immigrant community of mostly Germans and Irish. We were a diverse city. We supported the arts, education. We were considered the capital of the West. We were linked east and west by rail, north by canal, and of course south by the river. We were a city with many different views. We had riots, partisan press. We were a progressive, modern city. We had a professional fire department. We were worried though. We had rivals to the northwest, Chicago, and a rival to the west, St. Louis. The Cincinnati newspapers carried stories of Lincoln's inaugural journey. Our program tonight is based on newspaper and personal accounts. The president has arrived by train from Indianapolis. Mr. Hosea.
Ohio militia, attention!
Welcome, President-elect Mr. Abraham Lincoln.
Cincinnati Mayor Richard M. Bishop, a lifelong Democrat, welcomed Mr. Lincoln to Cincinnati. He escorted the president-elect to a carriage pulled by 6 white horses. The parade route to the Burnett Hotel was not a direct route. It snaked through Cincinnati streets. Militia units in new uniforms led the procession. A small German girl gave the president-elect a rose. Adults drank to his health along the route. The decorated streets and buildings were packed with large crowds. Several choruses sang patriotic songs along the route. 2.5-hour carriage ride ended when Mr. Lincoln arrived at the Burnett House. Now was finally the time for Lincoln's address to the large crowd. First Mayor Richard Bishop was announced. Ladies and gentlemen, children, I have the express honor today to introduce to you the Mayor of Cincinnati, the Queen City of the West, R.M. Bishop.
Honored sir, in the name of the people, pardon me, in the name of the people of all classes of my fellow citizens, I extend to you a cordial welcome, and in their behalf, I have the honor of offering you the hospitalities of Cincinnati.
Thank you.
Our city needs no eulogy from me. Her well-known character for enterprise, liberality, and hospitality is not more distinguished than is her fidelity and undying devotion to the union of these states. And a warm, filial, and affectionate regard for that noble standard that has braved the battle in the breeze on land and sea so many years. The people, under the solemn and dignified forms of the Constitution, have elected you the President of the United States, and as such, I greet you. And I know, go ahead. You will believe me when I say that it is the earnest and unified desire of our citizens that your administration of the general government may be marked with wisdom and patriotism and justice for all sections of the country. From the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, from the northern boundary of Maine to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, sir.
So that when you may retire from office, your fellow citizens may greet you everywhere with those charming words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." But sir, I see in this great and anxious concourse not only Ohio citizens, but also many from our sister state, Kentucky. Huzzah! The land of grain! The former home of your parents and mine, the place of our births. These too welcome you, for they, as we, are devoted to the Constitution and the Union. I again welcome you to our noble city and trust your short stay with us will be agreeable, and that your journey to the federal city will be pleasant and safe.
Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, 24 hours ago, I was in the capital of Indiana, and I said to myself, I don't believe I have ever seen such a vast assemblage of people in winter weather. I can no longer say that. It is what might reasonably have been expected at this great Cincinnati would thus acquit herself on such an occasion as this. My friends, I'm entirely overwhelmed by the magnificence of this turnout reception which has been given, and I do not say to me, but to the office of the President-elect of these United States of America. I'm reminded by the address of your worthy mayor that this reception is not given by any one political party. And even if I had not been so reminded by His Honor, I could not have failed to note that fact by the simple extent of this multitude that I see before me. I could not look upon this assemblage without being made aware that all parties have united here in this reception. This is as it should be. It is as it should be if Judge Douglas had been elected. And it is as it should be if Mr. Bell had been elected. It is as it should be if Mr. Breckinridge from Kentucky had been elected. It is as it should be whenever any citizen of these United States is elected president. Allow me to say that I think what has occurred here tonight could not have occurred in any other country in the world without the aid of the free institutions with which we have continuously enjoyed for what now, some 75 years, 3/4 of a century. There's no country in the world where people can turn out and enjoy a day such as this, just as they please, without the influence of the free institutions which we enjoy. I hope that, although we have some threatening national difficulties now, I hope that while these free institutions shall continue to be in the enjoyment of millions of free people in these United States, that we shall be seeing a repeat of these same occurrences every 4 years. In a few short years, I and every other individual man who is now living will pass away. And I hope that our national difficulties will also pass away. And I hope that we shall see in the streets of Cincinnati, good old Cincinnati, for centuries to come, once every 4 years, that people will give just such a reception as this to the constitutionally elected President of the whole United States. And I hope that the people of Cincinnati will all join in that reception. That you will welcome your brethren from far across the river to participate. We will welcome them. We will welcome every state of this union, no matter where they come from. From far away in the south, we will extend a cordial welcome to them. And our present differences will have been forgotten. Blown away like the wind. I've spoken here but once before this, Cincinnati. It was the year previous to the late presidential election, and on that occasion, in a somewhat playful manner, but with sincere words, I addressed myself, much of what I said, to Kentuckians. I gave my opinion that we, as Republicans, would ultimately beat them as Democrats. They could postpone that result longer by nominating Senator Douglas for the presidency. And probably any other way, they did not in any true sense of the word nominate Senator Douglas. And the result has come. Certainly as soon as even I had expected. I also told them what I expected in the way of their treatment once they had been beaten. And I now wish to recall their attention to what I said on that subject. I then said, when we do, as we say, beat you, and perhaps you will be wanting to know what we intend to do with you. And I shall tell you, so far as I'm authorized to speak for the opposition, what we mean to do with you. We mean to treat you as nearly as possible as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison treated you. We mean to leave you alone and in no way interfere with your institution, to abide by every and all the compromises in the Constitution. And in a word, coming back to the original proposition, to treat you according to the examples of our noble fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. We mean to remember that you are as good as we are. There's no other difference between us other than circumstances. And we mean to recognize and bear in mind always that you have as good a hearts as we, at least as we claim to have, and to treat you accordingly. Now, my fellow citizens of Kentucky, my friends, brethren, if I may, in my present position, I see no occasion and I feel no inclination to retract those words. If they shall not be made good, rest assured, it will be through no fault of mine. Now, to my fellow citizens of Ohio, you who I believe agree with him who now addresses you politically, I do not believe that you have ever entertained any other sentiments towards our brethren in Kentucky than those I have just now expressed to you. Do you, in fact? I did not believe so. Well, if that is the case, then why should we not hereafter continue on as brethren, in peace and in harmony with one another?
We will.
Good. And I take your response as perhaps the most reliable evidence, along with other evidences, trusting in the good sense of the American people on all sides of all rivers of these United States, and under the providence of God who has never deserted us, that we shall again be brethren, forgetting all parties, ignoring politics. And with that, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
After this speech, Mr. Lincoln retired to rooms inside the Burnett House for personal meetings and a festive dinner. This pleasant entertainment was interrupted by a group of about 2,000 German workmen. They came to serenade Mr. Lincoln. The president-elect went to the balcony to hear the Germans sing. representative of the German workmen, Fred Oberkleine, then addressed the president-elect.
To Abraham Lincoln, President-elect of the United States. Sir, we, the German free working men of Cincinnati, avail ourselves of this opportunity to assure you, our chosen Chief Magistrate, of our sincere and heartfelt regard. You earned our votes as champion of free labor and free homesteads. Our vanquished opponents have in recent times made frequent use of the terms working men in order to create an impression as if the mass of working men were in favor of compromise between the interests of free labor and slave labor, by which this victory you just won would be turned into a defeat. This is a despicable device of dishonest men. We spurn such compromises. We firmly adhere to the principles which directed our votes in your favor. We trust that you, the self-reliant, self-made man, will uphold the Constitution and the laws against such treachery and avowed treason. If to this end you should be in need of men, the German free working men of Cincinnati, with others, will rise as one man at your call, ready to risk their lives in an effort to maintain the victory already won by freedom over slavery.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you and those you represent for the compliment paid me by the tender of this little address. So far as there has been made an allusion to our present national difficulties and the suggestion that the views of the gentleman that has presented this address, I beg you to excuse me from responding particularly upon it. I deem it due to myself and really to the whole country in the present extraordinary condition which we find ourselves, that I should wait and see how the country and public opinion shall present themselves up to the very last minute before I give my views at the time of my inauguration. I hope that at that time that I shall not be false to anything that you have been taught to expect of me. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, and with the address representing your constituents in this delegation of working men, that working men are the basis of all governments. And I believe that those remarks are due to them more than to any other class, simply because they are greater in number than any other class. Your address is presented to me not only in behalf of workingmen, but especially of Germans. May I say a word about classes? I believe, that the value in life is to be able to improve one's condition. Whatever is calculated to advance the condition of an honest, struggling, laboring man, insofar as my judgment enables me to discover a correct thing, I am for that thing. An allusion has been made to the Homestead Law. I think it worthy of consideration that the wild lands of this country should be distributed so that every man should have the means to improve and benefit his own condition. I said that I do not desire to enter into details, nor will I. But in regard to Germans and foreigners, I esteem foreigners as no better than any other people, and no worse either. They are all part of the great family of man. And if there be one shackle upon any one of them, it would be far better to lift the load from them than to add additional loads upon them. And insomuch as the continent of America is a comparatively new country, and that other countries, comparatively speaking, are old countries, there's more room here, comparatively speaking, than there is there. And if they can better their condition by leaving their own homes and coming here, there is nothing in my heart to prevent them or forbid them from coming. I bid them Godspeed. Again, gentlemen, I thank you for this address, and I bid you farewell.
This was Lincoln's last visit to Cincinnati. Before his morning departure, he endured many more hours of meetings and handshaking. Later that evening, there was a lively banquet honoring the Prince of Rails, Robert Lincoln. After barely a night's rest, the President-elect, his family, entourage, left by the Little Miami Railway for Columbus. Now we're going to have press clippings and reports from papers on Mr. Lincoln's experience in Cincinnati. Moderator.
The newspaper coverage of Mr. Lincoln's visit was constant and complete. A sampling of the comments lifted from the Cincinnati Gazette, the Daily Commercial, Harper's New Monthly Magazine, and the New York Times will help you better appreciate the reception the citizens of Cincinnati gave to their president-elect's brief stay here. Before I share them with you, I want you to know that Cincinnati was very much a city of mixed loyalty during this time. That Ohio River runs south, and it ends in New Orleans. And a lot of the city's business interests wanted to see Mr. Lincoln compromise in order to keep the South in the Union. As was mentioned in this morning's newspaper, the anti-Lincoln Southern sympathizing press, which included the Cincinnati Enquirer, huffed and puffed over Lincoln's failure to deliver a substantial speech. Cincinnatians had expected, the Enquirer said, that Lincoln would embrace the opportunity to declare himself for that compromise and concession that is so urgently demanded by all the true friends of the Union, both North and South. He let the golden opportunity go unimproved. The pro-Republican press, however, was much more positive in their comments, and they capture the excitement of Lincoln's visit. And I quote from the sources mentioned earlier. As is customary in this and other cities of like caliber on such festive occasions, the city authorities and Grave Council assembled declared it to be a holiday, a day on which no money should be made, notes paid, or children taught.
Hear, hear.
No such exact verge of insanity was ever before reached as now pervades the population of this city in its length, breadth, and entirety. If ever Porkapolians, yes, I just said Porkapolians, a term that I'm pleased never caught on. If ever Porkapolians were from their innermost depths stirred up, now is the time. His coming was greeted by an outpouring of the people such as no man here ever before or since has received. They thronged in countless thousands about the station, along the line of his march, covering the housetops. They welcomed him with one continuous and unbroken storm of applause. From Kentucky, there were a great many visitors. Some came from curiosity, others for old acquaintance sake, but the vast majority of them were there because they desired the president-elect to feel that his friends do not all live in the free states, and that he has many a supporter and many a co-worker for the integrity of the Union in Old Kentuck, the home of Henry Clay. Old Abe's physique was freely discussed by the crowd, and they were evidently disappointed in not finding him so atrociously ugly as he had been represented. He looked very pale, very thin, very tired, and very dusty. Vine Street to the canal presented the most attractive and patriotic appearance. There was hardly a residence or a public building but what had every window decorated with flags. Banners were stretched across the street, and there were portraits of Washington and Lincoln, surrounded with wreaths of evergreen. From the canal to the Burnett House, the streets were lined with thousands of people. From Fifth to Third, it was one mass of human beings, and it was with the greatest difficulty that the carriage moved at all. From every window and housetop, handkerchiefs waved, and from the people in the street, the most enthusiastic and deafening cheers rent the air. Mr. Lincoln stood up bareheaded, holding on by a conveniently arranged board, and bowed, his backbone sore and his neck stiff, all the way to the hotel. When Mr. Lincoln arrived at the Burnett Hotel, one reporter described it as follows. A shout such has not been heard since the night when the ram-horn priest yelled down the walls of Jericho was uttered by the crowd, and for a few moments the uproar was, in no figurative sense, deafening. When the reception doors at the Burnett Hotel were thrown open to the public, it was reported this way in the Times. Mercy on me, what a set. Some in rags, some in jags, and some in velvet gowns, says an old nursery rhyme, but that does not begin to express it. All classes, all sorts, all conditions, all employments, all ages, both sexes, all styles, all nations, and apparently all creation were all represented there. Every man considered it his duty to shake old Abe's hand, and as if it were a pump handle or a delinquent scholar. He was called Old Man, Old Abe, Old Boy, Old Un, my friend, my cherished friend, our country's hope, and honest Old Abe. And that, as one well-known announcer used to say, is the way that it was in Cincinnati, Ohio, on February 12th, 1861. We're going to use the remainder of our time in a question and answer format. And we're going to do that in two ways. First, we're going to ask that you ask questions of Mr. Lincoln or Mr. President-elect. Then, after a few questions in that format, we're going to do what's called a hats-off question and answer session, where Abraham Lincoln will come current day to the actor Fritz Klein, and you will be able to ask him questions about playing the role of Abraham Lincoln. We'd ask if you have a question that you come forward here, and Mr. Lovie here with microphone will be able to entertain your questions, and so if you have a question, please come forward now. We had lots of questions the last session, so don't be bashful.
I'd like to ask Mr. Lincoln when he grew his beard. Did you have your beard actually here in Cincinnati?
Well, yes, sir, I have often had comments made about these chin whiskers, and I expect I should explain a bit. When I had a photograph made in New York City maybe 2 years ago, when I walked into the Brady studio, Mr. Brady wasn't there, but the man who was assigned to take a picture of me responded upon my appearance with, "Oh dear." When I was engaged in the past election process, I received a little letter from a young lady in Westfield, New York, who said that she had just come home from the fair and obtained a picture of me, and She thought the rail around it made it very pretty, but that my face appeared awfully thin, and that perhaps I ought to grow whiskers to fill it out a bit, I suppose. And she promised that if I should do so, she would get her brothers to vote for me, and if she were a man, she would vote for me, should I grow whiskers. Well, that was 4 extra votes right there. With very little trouble. I had a few Republican friends who thought it was a good idea as well, including Mrs. Lincoln. Somebody else? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Lovie's coming with the microphone.
How did you evaluate your speech patterns and your idiosyncrasies of speech?
Well, madam, I try not to evaluate them. I have plenty of people in the newspaper who are highly critical of my idiosyncrasies. Perhaps we can wait for a later moment to answer the true intent of your question. Is there anybody else who has a daring question to ask the President-elect?
I'm asking you as Mr. President-elect here, not as the actor.
What actor?
But I think you're... all politicians are great actors, are they not? But the essence of your speech, I think, was very clear to me, an objective listener, that you were willing to, said you would make any compromise or do anything necessary pretty much to preserve the Union and to extend your hand to the brethren to the South and Kentucky and Deep South, and let's all be together and work together, etc., etc. Do you have any comments on the Western Territories? Was there anything else that you might not compromise on, Mr. President?
Well, if you inferred, or I implied, that I was willing to make any compromise for the preservation of the Union, then both you and I were wrong. There are those who wish me to issue such a word of compromise. I believe it would be not only dishonorable to unsay the very things upon the faith of which I stand before you today in my present position. It would be not only dishonorable but treachery. A word of compromise in order to retain a minority. How shall I say this? We are possessed of a government in which all substantial can enter in. Once an election is settled, then the question is decided by the majority, and the minority must acquiesce, and they shall be protected in their acquiescence. However, if they insist upon threatenings and will not acquiesce, and insist on compromise in order for the individual who has been duly elected to eventually become inaugurated, then we have ceased to be a free government. We have allowed the minority to gain the upper hand over the majority, and unseated the very principle upon which the Republic was built. So, sir, there are certain things which I will not compromise. They say that a ship is designed to carry its cargo. I will not abandon the ship of state as long as the cargo is yet there, regardless of the storm. The cargo is precious. I should probably answer about the Western Territories. I'm sorry.
All right. Go ahead, Mr. Lincoln.
I will be brief. As I said, we have vast holdings in the West, and I believe that everyone should be entitled to himself. I have mentioned on occasion that something of a self-made man, it was alluded to earlier. Not everybody, perhaps, is agreeable to those little great doctrines, as Henry claimed to call them. I one time mentioned in Illinois, I was a self-made man, and I think everybody else should be. And a man come up to me afterwards and he said, well, I think you did a blame poor job of it. And he said, I wouldn't vote for you if you're St. Peter yourself. And I said, well, sir, if I were St. Peter, you probably wouldn't be in my district anyway.
Glad he asked to finish the question. Because of the late hour, we're going to switch the format now. We're going to encourage questions for the actor, Fritz Klein. And I'm going to begin with the first question, which picks up on the one we just had regarding your vocal patterns, intonations. As the actor, Fritz Klein, how do you attack that?
Okay, well, there they go. When I first began doing this many years ago, I read about descriptions as well as the words, and I read a lot of things that came from Lincoln's relatives, his roots. And there were verbal descriptions of how he sounded, such as he had a higher pitched voice. I don't know if you noticed I called him Mr. Chairman instead of Mr. Chairman. A chair was a cheer when Lincoln said it. He said over there instead of over there. He said fur instead of for. Those things were written phonetically by people who heard him. So I began to incorporate some of those patterns. Another thing that was said often about him was that he spoke with a nasal sort of voice and a high pitch. It had kind of a blabbing effect. If you've ever sat right in front of a trumpet player on Easter morning service, you'll know what I mean. So, and then of course he was a Kentuckian, and so there was a bit of Southern isms in his manner, and he had habits of saying some rather country things, like there's a heap of you here, and, things that we don't often hear. So I've kind of put all those together. Okay, somebody else? Yeah, I can probably hear them. I got big ears.
Well, I was wondering how you got into this career, into acting as Abraham Lincoln.
Great question. Well, I started in landscape. Actually, I studied to be a Lutheran minister, but it was terminated. I won't say why. So I took up landscaping, but I did acting as a hobby on the side, and we lived in Hawaii, and great place for landscaping. And so I had a role in a semi-annual play as Lyman Beecher.
So what do you think of the program?
Well, I really enjoyed it. It was really well done. I mean, everything about it, the introductions and the people in character. It almost felt like you were back in time.
Yeah. Did you learn anything new that you didn't know before?
Yeah, I mean, some of the old pictures of Cincinnati and the train. I didn't know that they had such an involved train route going to the inauguration. I thought it would just be going right to it, but they went Indianapolis, here, and Columbus after.
Right, and then New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, yeah. Excellent.
So today I found out, I looked up before we came here, like, I knew that Atlanta was a small city, but in 1860 Atlanta was only like 9,600 residents. Cincinnati was the 7th largest city. I looked that up.
Yeah.
We were bigger than Chicago then, so it really piqued my interest. So well done program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.